These are all fascinating. But the story that we're most interested in this summer is the fact that the Vought's and the two subsequent families who were named Race and... Okay, we know their names.
It's pretty, yeah. It's quite true, yeah.
And
Benjamin Stout.
we're all...
Who was Benjamin Stout?
Benjamin Stout.
Stout, okay. They were all slave owners. And so the people who probably helped build this house, and certainly the people who took care of the family in the house, were people of African descent. And as you can imagine, people of African descent in history in the United States being enslaved are not the main subject of most historical records. And therefore we have turned in the study of American history to archaeology to help recover their story. They were here, but they're not mentioned, or they are mentioned, it's mentioned in passing. We know very little about them. And the more archaeologists have worked, whether it's been in the Caribbean or in South America or in the American South, or increasingly now in what was the northern states, we're realizing there's a lot that we can learn. So we were fascinated when we learned of this site and its connection to slavery, and the fact that there has been an archaeological study of the property done around 10 years ago by a firm called Hunter Research based in Trenton. In that survey, which is looking over the property and assessing the integrity of the archaeological deposits, is there archaeology here that's worth preserving and worth keeping in mind as the site is being developed, as anything around it is being developed? And indeed the answer was yes. But in that study, they found a small outbuilding, which Don pointed out was the ancillary house, which what that means would have been a place where the older generation would have imagined moving into as the son of the upcoming generation becomes the head of household. So rather than everyone living in one big house, there's a separate house for the seniors. You could look at it that way. That may have been what it was built for, that may have been what it is used for, but we don't know. There's no record that says, I moved out to the house. I moved out to the ancillary house. One reason is the end of the Vought's tenure because of the war. But at the same time, a small house, 12 by 14 in size, separate, couldn't have been a slave quarter. Whether the Vought's built it as such, whether they used it as such, or whether the families that came after them did, it's a question we want to ask, because it gives us a chance of thinking about the presence of these people of African descent here in Clinton, here at the Vought House site, and we think that's important for us to contribute. We're actually, one other part that's really exciting about this project is this is a historic house in the making. While there's a very powerful narrative, Don and Frank and everyone I've worked with has been very open to the idea of expanding what the stories that can be told and that we can learn about in this house. And that's not always the case. You go to a lot of historic houses, they're very comfortable with their narrative and they don't really want to talk about slavery. Though many of the historic houses that you may have had some experience visiting or learning about in one form or another were also places where people of African descent lived, worked, and alongside the famous person or family that you may have associated with the house. So that's our research interest, and we're hoping that we'll be able to figure out from what we excavate today this summer, is this house from the right time period when slaves were living at the Vought House site? Is there anything in the ground that would say, hey, this is unusual, this doesn't look like a European pattern, maybe it's something that's African in origin, or anything else that can help us understand this house as a possible slave quarter. And then in addition to that, what Jamie's going to be doing is historical research on slavery in Hunterdon County to kind of give a historical database which will help to go together with the archaeology to tell that story. So the archaeology starts us on an interesting quest. So, on to how to do it. All right, what is the archaeological record? You've probably all heard the term the archaeological record, right? It's something that's out there in the world. And we think of it as these things, the buried remains of past human activities. People did stuff and there's stuff left behind, right? They broke a bottle in the shards in the ground. They built a house, the house got torn down and there's foundations in the ground or something like that. Something that happened in the past is still there for us to recover, all right? And it's buried. And then we also often think of it archaeology, the artifacts and features produced in the making of life and culture. All right, so artifacts, those little bits and pieces, sometimes they're not so little, sometimes they're not in pieces, but usually in archaeology they are. All right, the things that end up in the ground for us to excavate are not the things you're going to find that went into a museum. Those are the well-preserved and curated nice pieces. Ours is the trash, the stuff that people threw out and left behind or didn't even know they didn't have anymore. But that's what we think of when we think of archaeology, and that's completely correct. There are objects in the ground. They are part of what people in the past did to live their everyday, normal, routine lives, living in and around a house. What you also want to keep in mind, as an archaeologist, is that the archaeological record isn't just what's out there in the world awaiting discovery. It's also what we do, because it's what we do by excavating, by making a record of our own in notes, forms, photographs, drawings, and thinking, right? It's what we do that actually gets written up, that this is what the archaeology of this site is. So what I'm doing is I'm putting a great deal of responsibility on all your shoulders to take what you're doing seriously, to understand that you're responsible for what you're doing. You're not going to be unsupervised, so don't worry about it too much. But in the end, when you scrape your trowel across the ground, that changes the archaeological site. That dirt hasn't been moved in 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. So every time you do something like that, you change the world, you change the archaeological site, and it's your doing. So you have to understand that we need to know that you know that that's part of what you're doing, right? It's not just digging and saying, hey, look what I found. That's not how we do it, all right? So, in other words, the record is what we produce as much as what is actually left in the ground, how we do it. And I'll come back to talking about notes and forms, photographs, and drawings. And for the most part, you're not going to be responsible for this record. That's Jamie's job, that's my job. All right, we make a record of what you're doing, but we're going to sit and talk to you. What happened? What did you find here? What was it? What was the soil like? All right, little minute questions that you're going to be very comfortable answering, because you're going to get some training tonight. You're also going to get some experience when you come out to help us on how to answer them. All right, but it is because you're telling us that we write it down. It goes in the record, and there it is. Okay, so it's the record of our work. Now, as I mentioned, scrape your trowel across the ground. You change it. All right? You are, in effect, destroying something that hasn't been damaged, hasn't been touched, hasn't been interacted with by human beings for however long. All right? The reason it is called a destructive discipline is that we cannot say, oops, we made a mistake. Throw all the dirt back in and we'll dig it again and get it right. We don't get that, all right? That if you make a mistake in a chemistry lab, put the wrong chemicals in or the wrong amounts of them, you can say, oh, that didn't work, let's try it again. Because you have more of the same chemicals, the more measuring things, let's get the ratio just right. We don't get to do that in archaeology. Every archaeological site is a unique set of what we call deposits, things that have been put in the ground, in very particular relation to each other, all right? From the top to the bottom, and I'll explain top and bottom in a minute, is in a particular and unique arrangement. And it's our job to record as we're going down and removing, all right, all that soil and sediment, what it was, all right? So the translation from an archaeological deposit to the archaeological record is, as we dig, making a reproduction of it in notes, photographs, drawings, thoughts. All right? Does that make sense? All right? Just keep it in mind. You can't go back and do it again. All right? So one of the reasons that what we do in archaeology is we don't dig the whole of everything, because we want to make sure that in case we have an opportunity to look again at something now that we know something more about it, we haven't dug it all up already. Right? Each step is learning along the way. All right, now, some of the legal parts, all right? A site like the Vought House obviously already has a great deal of historical significance. Don, is it on the National Register of Historic Places? So this house is on the National Register of Historic Places, which means that Don submitted the application. Let's give him the credit for it anyway. Which to the federal government to say this is an important site that should be preserved at the national level, and it goes on a list. There's hundreds of sites across the country that are on this list, and all of them are worthy. But what it means is that if you want to think about this site in any serious way, you need permission to do so. I mean, I think about it like, maybe we want to have a tour here, or maybe we want to renovate it and open it as a house museum. Maybe when we want to do an archaeological excavation. It means that it has to have outside reviewers who are professionals, my peers, Usually these are government people, we call them archaeologists, working in government, who review proposals. And so we submitted a proposal to the New Jersey State Historic, no, the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office, which is usually the State Historic Preservation Office, or the SHPO. Every state has a SHPO. For them to review what we're going to do and determine whether what we're doing is something that is not only worth doing, but that we're thinking about it in ways that meet the standards that they expect of professional archaeology. And we did, without any trouble. But nevertheless, to know that this is not just a whim, this isn't something that, oh, what a fun idea. This is a somewhat serious business. We are responsible not only for training you tonight, showing you how things work out on the site, making a complete record of what we do, and writing a professional report of what we do, but also that report will be reviewed and sent back to us to make sure it meets the standards of the state, who will be ultimately responsible for saying, we approved this project and here's the final result. All right, so that's very important. Every site is given a number. This site is 28 HU 550. 28 you might encounter this code. 28 means New Jersey, 28th state alphabetically. HU means Hunterdon County. 550 means it was the 550th site registered in the county from when they started doing this in the 60s. Okay, and this applies to a lithic scatter from 2,000 years ago from Native Americans who were making stone tools to much more developed sites. It's every site that gets a board registered with the state one at a time. I'm sure this number, since this was a registration that was made probably more than 10 years ago, I'm sure this number's up over 1,000. For sure. I've essentially covered that. Okay. Now, excavation. The funnest part, the hardest part of archaeology is the actual ground research. You don't think of the lab work, you don't think of the writing, most people. You think of the digging, which is one section, but it's the section you're going to be involved in, so let's spend some time on it. All right, excavation means the actual recovery of archaeological remains. There's things in the ground out there, we're going to go get them, but we have to do it in a particular way. I'm going to describe that a little bit today, Jamie and I both. All right, I see it as a three-stage process. First, we have to establish a grid. Then we have to establish what I call vertical control, top to bottom. Then horizontal control across the site. All right, and that all has to be woven together in a way that makes sense to everyone. My goal for you, as you're helping us out, will be to make sure you understand where you are, how it's related to other things that are going on, how it's related to the house, how it's related to the history of the house, so that you can begin to piece those things together, so you can see how what your little part is. You're out for a day. It's a very little part, but understand how it fits into something more, something larger, which ties into interpreting this particular site. Okay, so I'll start with the grid. All right, this is out of a textbook. It's a prehistoric rock shelter site from Nevada called Gate Cliff Shelter. All right, but it shows you how a grid works. Another way to think of what a grid is that if you ever had a map of Hunterdon County or New Jersey, and you look at the index, and it says Clinton's in square B5, right? And then you go onto the map and you see there's a grid imposed over that picture of the county, and you could go to, well, B5 isn't a good choice. Let's say it was J7, okay? You go to J, you go over to 7, and Clinton, New Jersey would be right here. It couldn't be simpler, right? Everyone gets it. It's straightforward. What that does is that gives us a way of putting everything in one spatial order. But it's important to understand, we impose that order on the site. All right? That's out there waiting to be discovered. We lay that on top the way that grid used with the references in the index is laid on top of an image of the actual map of New Jersey as an example. All right? The reason we do this is it gives us sort of a control over how the site is going to be understood. Because when we dig, we don't dig holes just randomly. We dig along the grid. What we're going to be doing this summer is excavating 6 1-meter by 1-meter excavation units. All right? Those are 6 squares, essentially, 1 meter on the side. All right? And that's essentially what you see here. Just a whole bunch of squares, right? So that when we excavate, what we're doing is we're going to be going from top to bottom in each square, but we're going to be allowed to know where each square is vis-a-vis the other ones, vis-a-vis other known features on the site, which I'll show you in a minute, and how to be able to understand how this whole set of deposits or the sediments and artifacts and everything that are in the ground go together. All right? The way the site grid works to begin with is it has a data point. Data point is the origin. The The young people, more so maybe than the older folks, remember geometry. The Cartesian coordinates, right? What's the center called? Right here where my two knuckles meet. It's called the origin, right? It's also called the datum point, right? Arbitrarily, it's where the x and the y, and for us, the z axes all come together. Sometimes it's too abstract. Others I see are nodding along, and this is, you have an acuity for the abstraction in place, and that's fine. None of this is difficult in practice. Okay, so this is an example of how a grid would look superimposed over a site that looks probably more familiar to you than a rock shelter, than a plan view of a rock shelter. This is the base of a building. It's actually located in New Orleans. I worked for a short period in New Orleans, at the University of New Orleans. And we excavated this building in the middle of an industrial factory's courtyard, and this was an old plantation house. So this is the back of the house, the side of the house, and the brick courtyard. But what's nice about that is you can see the archaeological features, right? You can see the pieces of the architecture that were there below ground, but on top of that you can see our strings, right, which show you the grid. This square here is archaeologically significant in terms of our terminology and understanding the site, even though it is, because we can say this entire unit was in this courtyard area. This entire unit is out and behind the house or something like that. And you start to put them together and you can see they're just 2 meters apart from each other. All right, but just for the sake of understanding, the grid gives us control over a place like that, which could be thousands of artifacts and a great deal of complicated deposits in the ground, but we can look at it one square at a time, put squares together, and while that might not seem like a big deal because, it's the back of the house, I get it. It's important because we start dealing with thousands of little pieces of information and we need to put it all back together when we write the report. So this gives us that control that we need to have. Okay. With the grid, we also think bigger. And so the process usually starting an archaeological project is to map out what the site looks like. This is from the Hunter report from 2005, showing you right here the footprint, or the footprint's the best word for it, of the Vought House as it looked then. This is the
wagon shed.
Wagon shed.
Yeah.
It would have stood back here. Here's the big barn before the hurricane. And they identified this area here as sort of the archaeologically significant zone. They dug a number of what we call shovel test pits, which are small exposures of the deposits that go down to look for distributions of artifacts to say this area looks productive, this area looks disturbed, like something happened here. They built a building, they tore it down, they dumped a lot of things. And what they found was right along the road, the foundation of a summer kitchen, which in the line drawing that Don showed you was off to the side. All right, and they also found down in here the ancillary house, or what they're thinking is the ancillary house, because it's another foundation. All right, and so this is where we're going to be spending our time. We're down here looking to expose more of that, but this gives you a sense. The map shows you how everything all goes together in a bigger view than just what we excavate, but for the whole site. All right, and as I mentioned, we are closing in on this. You can see they've got a little dotted line right there. So if you've been to the house, this is the front, this is the porch that was just removed this spring. So you're kind of down south and a little east. And we are going to be, like I said, going to spend your day or two or your week. Okay. I pass the torch to Jamie, but I'm coming back.
So I'm basically going to explain to you guys how to read the different layers of the soil as you're excavating the ancillary house. So the description of the study is called stratigraphy. So it's basically a branch of study in geology of the relations of the soil at different points in time. Now geologists are concerned of how these different soil layers, otherwise known as strata, are produced through human activity. And in this picture here, you can see that the soil changed various times, and each of these different layers means a different point in time. So the way that we excavate it is that we have vertical control of maybe 5 to 10 centimeters, and we basically look for small changes of different soil color or texture, and basically we jot all those notes down and we interpret them later on in the site. So you basically want to think of stratigraphy as a big cake, a tier layered cake, and every layer is a different point in time. So if you look at this photo in relation to an archaeological site down in Nevada, you have one layer of cake in 1300 AD, and then another in 700 AD. And all of these layers are basically taken in relation to the highest deposit is what's closest to the relative point in time. So anything in the topmost layer is going to be the most recent, while anything in the bottom layer is the oldest. So as you're going down, you always have to remember that, okay, anything I'm excavating right now is the most modern, and as I go down, I'm getting to the older deposits. So I should be seeing things of ceramics in like the 17th century or like the 16th century. So you always want to remember that everything from the top is the most recent, and as you go down, it's the oldest. Yes, it's all equally delicious. Sometimes as archaeologists, we have what's known as complex stratigraphy. So you have basically events in the archaeological record that have multiple events going on, and we just try to make sense of it. So this down here is sterile earth, which means there was no type of human activity there whatsoever, and we read it going oldest to youngest. So we have all these different events happening, and we have to remember that no event could have occurred without the strata layer under it. So you see this is sterile earth, and then you see these hash marks over here will signify shell and charcoal. So probably someone had like a clam bake, and then they left all of their shell deposits there. And then you have this sandy, prickly layer over here, but then you also have these concrete depressions and this ditch right here. But you have to remember that this could not have been there without your sandy layer. So your sandy layer came first, and then you see that there's this ditch, which is also known as a foundation pit. So you had to have made your foundation pit before you made these foundation stones. And then you had your earth layer, which is this right here. And then you have this rubble, this burned rubble. So maybe the house there burned down before you had your wind-blown sand over here. So we as archaeologists have to interpret all of these complex different events in time and different layers of the soil. And then of course you have your most recent, which probably these kids came out of nowhere and they were like, oh, let's dig a hole. So they decide to dig a hole, dump their trash in, and then they leave to go do some other stuff. Here's a photo of an archaeological site that Chris and I worked on last summer, and also Jeff is sitting in the background. So in this unit here, we excavated all the way down to sterile earth, and we also noticed in this, you have two separate units going on. There's one here, and there's another unit here, and there's one here. But we noticed in this unit that we had foundation stones. So we had different points of human activity, or strata layers, open at the exact same time. So that can get a little confusing. So we always want to make sure that you always have the correct paperwork, whichever unit you're working in. And if you always get lost, you could always ask questions. Someone will be around there. But we basically wanted to expose all of these foundation stones, so that's why we opened up a second unit here to see the entire picture. So we had different points of time open at the exact same time. Does that make sense? Okay, so what you want to take away from this is that basically stratigraphy is like a cake. Every layer is a different point in time. The most recent time is on top. The oldest time is on the bottom. And you could always have more than one layer open at the same time, giving you different points of human activity.
Jamie, on our site,
Yes.
the top layer is going to be plow zone, I would think.
Yeah, the top layer is going to be plow
And
zone.
how deep typically is plow zone?
Plow zone, it depends. I mean, I've been on a site recently, and the plow zone was about 12 centimeters,
Okay.
give or take.
Okay.
So it'll depend on how the soil changes, the soil color
Yeah.
changes. Okay, here are some basic vocabulary words that you'll be hearing as arbitrary level, so it'll be, we'll dig at 5 to 10 increment centimeters at a time. And so those will be known as our levels. We'll also have features, which are dramatic changes in the soil color, which basically represent huge events, like a burned down building. You'll see like a large deposit of ash and burnt wood. Natural deposits can be known as anything made by wind or water or bioturbitation, which basically means root growings or animal burrowings. You'll get a lot of worms out there, I can guarantee that. So you'll get worms, you'll get beetles, and you'll be able to see all the holes they make within the grass and within the soil. And of course you'll see cultural deposits, which is anything made within human activity. More common words that we'll be using are midden, which is basically a long-term human activity event that will be going on. So someone will have like a trash pit open in the back of their house, and they'll just constantly be dumping things there. And it's if we were to excavate a midden, it'd be long-term human activity within that specific area. And another one is a fill, which is an intentional deposit of soil used to raise the ground surface. So if someone put in, if they wanted to put in an outback kitchen, they needed fill to hold those stones of the huge house. So you'll be able to see that in the soil deposit. It'll probably be like a bright sandy color. Well, it depends. Yeah, sometimes it's a bright sandy color. Sometimes it's a marble brown color. But we'll basically be digging every unit until we get to sterile earth, which is it'll be wet. You'll probably hit the water table at some point, and it'll just be like really muck, heavy sand. So I'm going to talk about some of the tools we'll be using. This right here is our trusty trowel. Now what you want to do with the trowel is you never want to dig into the soil. We always want to take each layer scraped toward you. And I don't know how else to explain. You basically you waste more energy in your body trying to dig something out than you would scraping it toward you. So you get the highest amount of energy if you scrape the trowel toward you as you're excavating in your unit. These little devices over here are called line levels, which you can be seen used in this excavation unit, and we use these line levels to get the proper elevation within the unit, and then we measure at the end of every unit how high it is from our starting point in the datum. We'll also have scoopers to take the dirt out to help you put it in the bucket. We'll have plenty of tape measures. These are our unit lines. You never want to cut the unit lines because they tell you where to keep the relative digging of our sample within the site grid.
Jamie, will the volunteers need to have trowels, or are you going to provide them?
We'll be providing trowels. We'll be providing all the equipment. I mean, you guys can buy. You're welcome to buy your own trowels, but we'll have trowels. This right here is our drawing grid, and we basically place it over the excavation unit so that we can draw a photo of it, or draw a picture of it. As Chris said before, we will be drawing a lot of pictures of the foundation stones because we want a clear-cut photo of everything because archaeology is a destructive science. Here's a photo of a dig that Chris recently did at Montclair, and you can see another tool that we're using are our sifters. So we basically take all the dirt that we're digging out and we put it on these sifters, and any of the artifacts that come out of this dirt we put into a bag. We label all those bags, and you always want to make sure that anything you get out of that specific level you put in that bag. So of course later on we'll be explaining what goes on the bag and where the bags go once you're done excavating that specific level. So yeah, it was really cold that day. Another tool that we use is a total station, which is basically a computerized device that will help us geographically place dots within our geographical space and plug them into a computer. can get photos like digitized photos like this of any structure that we take a photo of. So for this specific site, I'm planning to block out all of the excavation units that we do, and I'm going to put it into a GIS or a Geographic Information Systems program called ArcMap, and basically see where all my excavation units are and write a report of artifact distribution of where there was the most activity on the site. Oh, and you also see like engineers and like plumber guys on the street using the same thing. So it's all the same thing. We all borrow each other's surveying tools. Another thing you'll see us using is a photo board. So we basically, like Chris said before, we take a picture of everything. We also have a scale on and a north arrow to explain to us, just as we take the photo, how big, to remind us how big the stones were. Or this right here is a photo of a post hole, so let us know how big the post hole was. And on the photo board is the name of the site, which for this one was the Thompson House, the specific site number, and the name of the unit we were using, and the coordinates of that unit. And of course the date to let us know when we did it.
My turn again. Okay. Decided we don't need to have this stuff tonight. I'm sure you've got a lot of information. So, stratigraphy means what? Piece of cake. It's a piece of cake, right? Top to bottom. Now you understand, one layer at a time. I'm going to talk I'm going to talk in a little bit about how to start thinking about how to understand that. But again, that's something that's going to be easier to explain when we're out there showing you actually how it works. Okay. So we've talked about creating the grid. We've talked about vertical control, now horizontal control. And this, I want to bring up this word feature again. So what a feature is a drastic change in the soil or some component of the site that's still there that'll help us understand how it was actually used as a living space in the past. So, for example, do I have anything on now? Let me just move ahead. So, for example, how about this? What we're actually going to dig. The excavation that happened 10 years ago at the site did 2 units, one here called EU6, excavation unit 6, and then a little extension over here, then excavation unit 7. And locating in those 2 units, this stone foundation, which is this unit, is this unit, okay? The line drawing in a photograph. See the nice north arrow and the scale and all that. All right, this is what they uncovered, all right? They also have another one over here. And finding those 2, they actually used a probe to test where this feature or this foundation of the house, where it was located. So it's our plan to dig more of and expose more of this foundation, do one on the inside and then some on the outside because we want to find out the deposits that would have surrounded the house. We want to know, was there a chimney somewhere? If it was something that somebody lived in, they had to have some sort of heat source. So that's going to be one easy way to answer the question. No chimney, it's not a house. All right, so we're going to find a chimney. All right, and then what that means, maybe we'll find if it was a brick chimney, maybe it fell over, and we'll find the fragments of the brick when it fell, or we might find some variation in what they've drawn. See, anything that wasn't exposed is just a hypothetical image. All right, and we'll see maybe it's wider in one place where a chimney would have been, would have been the foundation support for a.